Imagine your favorite street in the world. It might be where you grew up, it might be a place you visited, it might be where you went to school. So imagine that place, walking down the street, maybe driving, riding your bike, and all of a sudden you see this. What's your first reaction? Is it excitement? Is it skepticism? Is it concern? If we listen to the report outs from public hearings, it might be alarm. So we live in a sort of split screen culture. On the one hand, we have a lot of conversation in the news about how important it is to build in the US and how hard it is to get things built. We're in a housing crisis that's decades old. We can't get transmission lines permitted fast enough to meet demand. Our roads and bridges are crumbling. And there's a growing debate about the extent to which we should be building more data centers to train generative AI models. And if we listen to policymakers and pundits, what we hear is that the problem is red tape. We need to loosen our regulations so that it's easier and quicker and less expensive to permit projects, and that way we can start building again as a country. The problem is that when those projects make their way to the local permit, they encounter the kind of emotions that you guys might have felt thinking about some unknown construction project on your favorite street, right? Like, why is this happening? Nobody talked to me about it. Like, is this gonna be a good thing or a bad thing? It causes alarm, right? I'd like to share kind of two experiences from my own personal background looking at this. I'm from Houston, Texas, and a few years ago, I mean a long time ago, decades now, a developer wanted to build a multi-family apartment building in my neighborhood, which is mostly 1 and 2 story buildings. And I'd say the response from the community was mostly what we call NIMBY, not in my backyard. So there was a lot of unhappiness about that proposal. In a different part of town, professionally, I was asked to perform a health impact assessment for a proposed freeway expansion for a freeway that goes straight through the middle of town. And when it was built decades ago, it caused a lot of harm in the neighborhoods that it destroyed and kind of fragmented. And those were the same neighborhoods that were going to be further impacted by that expansion. And so my health impact assessment was looking at, well, what could be the potential environmental, economic, and health impacts of further expanding that freeway. In both of these examples, the apartment building and the freeway, the community was, not feeling like their voice was heard during the planning process. And as a result, lawsuits were filed to try and stop the projects. In both cases, the projects eventually moved forward, but they were years behind schedule. And so if you kind of think about that split screen of the people who really want to get things built and the reaction that we feel when, as a community, when a project comes into town and we feel like we weren't really consulted, you can kind of begin to understand the human side of why things aren't getting built. Has anybody here ever gone to a public hearing for a proposed development project? A few people? Yeah. They can be really dramatic. So the way that they work usually is you have, they open the mic first to people who are in support of the project. And a lot of the time what you'll see is like the mayor or the Chamber of Commerce will talk about how it's going to expand the tax base. You might have labor come out and talk about potential job opportunities, either for the construction or even long-term increases in jobs. And then the architect and the developer will come out and talk about all the great things that this project's going to do for the community, and say we'd like a little bit more flexibility in the regulations in order to allow us to meet the environmental and the economic development goals for the project and still make a profit. And that process usually takes about 20 to 30 minutes. The next phase of the public hearing, depending on how controversial it is, can take hours. It can go on into the early hours of the morning. And it's, the types of statements that you'll hear from community members and local businesses are quite varied. You can see, is the concerns about energy and water consumption, concerns about habitat destruction, concerns about exposure to flooding, health concerns about increases in air pollution. A lot of times the community members want to understand how the project's going to change the character of their community. And local businesses might be worried about their bottom line. Longtime residents might be concerned about increases in property taxes. And so what you end up with is kind of this mosaic of statements, some in opposition and some in support. And if you look at each of them in isolation, from the perspective of the person who's giving the statement, they all make sense, right? The problem is that they're not made in isolation. They're actually, if you think about it one way, each of those people getting up and giving a statement is in a sense representing some area or portion or segment of society. And each of those segments of society are related to each other. But the way that we're treating them is as though they're not. And let me just give you an example. Let's pretend I went to the public hearing for this apartment building. And I'm a homeowner, and so maybe I decide that I'm going to make a statement as an individual and say I'm concerned about traffic and flooding and all those different things. So I'm opposed. But I'm also an architect and a green and healthy building consultant. And so if that architect and developer had gotten up and said, we're trying to make this the greenest, most health promoting project in all of Houston, I might be supportive of it when I have that hat on. If I also sit on the planning board, I might have been persuaded by the increase in the tax base and the jobs that could be created. And so the question is, what do I do if I'm sitting in that room and all of those things are true? I am actually, depending on which hat I put it on at each moment, I would agree with all of those statements. And I think the problem is that the way that these public hearings are set up, and just generally our process is set up, it kind of places these two groups in opposition. So it seems like the answer has to be either we listen to the community and their concerns, and so we don't go through with the project, or we ignore the community and their concerns and we go through the project. But obviously that doesn't make sense. And again, that might be why we're having such a hard time getting things built. So a few years ago, I started developing a different method that is kind of takes public health methods and applies them to the design and development process. It's called architectural epidemiology. And it's intended as an alternative to this current process. So the way it works is we take neighborhood data about people in place and we combine it with community engagement and use that engagement to create a shared vision for the project. So by the time you get to the public hearing, everybody's in support of offering the permit, because all of those public statements that right now happen at the very end of the process have been moved up earlier in the process, and they're informed by evidence and the residents' lived experience. So I'm going to share with you a few examples of successful projects that have taken this type of approach. And these are drawn from a set of case studies that I developed for the American Institute of Architects. The first one is the Louisiana Children's Museum. The architects are Methuen and Wagner and Ball. It's located in New Orleans, Louisiana, where the median family income is about 32% lower than the national average. The food insecurity rate is about 30% higher than the national average. And at the time of the design, Louisiana ranked 48 out of 50 states in educational attainment. So over a period of about 5 months, talking with children and families. The two big themes kind of rose to the surface in terms of important aspects of the design. One was addressing the kind of ongoing intergenerational trauma of relationship with water that children were still experiencing in New Orleans decades after Hurricane Katrina. And the other was the importance of highlighting the diversity of cultures within New Orleans. And so if you look at the final project, it's located in City Park, which is kind of in the center of New Orleans. It's designed to functionally reduce flood risk in surrounding neighborhoods, some of which are pretty low income. And the exhibits really attempt to create both a knowledge base and a sense of connection with the water system and ecosystem in southern Louisiana, as well as making that connection between how water and the water cycle and that ecosystem have influenced the culture of New Orleans over time. The second example is Williams Terrace, which is a senior public housing development in Charleston, South Carolina. The designers were David Baker Architects and McMillan Paston Smith Architecture. This is a project that is located in a neighborhood of Charleston that has provided workforce housing since the 1700s. It's a neighborhood where 30% of the population is over 65 years old, and its poverty rate is 35% higher than Charleston's average. Now the public support for this project was based in a large part because it was able to catalyze cleanup and redevelopment of a contaminated site that was acting as a barrier between the historic part of New Orleans, where you might have visited if you've gone there as a tourist, and the port. And the final project actually includes a public park and market rate housing in addition to Williams Terrace. And as you can see here from the final design, it has deep porches which help protect the residents from the summer sun, in southeast part of the U.S. They also moved the laundry room and the community room from the ground floor up to the roof to protect it from flooding. And the result of those two design decisions actually had the additional contributing factor for creating space for social connection among the residents. And this is a population that's sort of at the time of life where they're at higher risk of feeling socially isolated. My third example here is the I-5 Rose Quarter Independent Cover Assessment, which was designed by the architecture firm CGF. I-5 is a freeway that goes right through the middle of Portland, Oregon, very similar history to what I described in Houston, but the outcome was different. This is a neighborhood that was really harmed by the creation of I-5 in the 1960s. It still has a higher percentage of African American population than other parts of Portland. It has a smaller percentage of young children and teenagers than the rest of Portland, and its poverty rate is twice Portland. And so a local nonprofit called Albina Vision Trust worked with local agencies to persuade the Oregon Department of Transportation into working more closely with the community to revise their design for that expansion. And instead, what they've ended up with, instead of expanding that corridor further into a neighborhood that had already been damaged, they have been they both recognize the original harm that was created through that construction, and they're trying to repair it to some extent. So the idea is to create a cap over the freeway where the Albina neighborhood is located, and then knit the two neighborhoods together on either side of the freeway. It's also focusing on trying to build opportunities for housing, home ownership, and also cultural expression within the neighborhood. So I think the question for us is to say, well, why is it that these three projects were so successful in creating some sort of outcome that is buildable and also acceptable to the community? And a few years ago, I ran a study to try and answer that question. And three themes really emerged from it. The first was that architectural epidemiology moves away from the idea of architects and developers and local officials kind of presenting themselves as the experts, and the only role that community has is to kind of vote an already designed project up or down. Instead, we move the design, the community engagement process earlier in the process, and they really begin to co-design all of these projects. The other is that we use data as a design tool. And when we do that, it kind of creates these natural guardrails so that it's harder for individual, one or two ideas to kind of take over the conversation. And it also makes it easier to visualize how one stakeholder group's motivations and goals link over to another one's. And you can see the evidence linking the two. And it actually speeds up the process. And then finally, we set up this process in a way so that everybody who's involved feels like their voice is heard. So I'm going to close with just a few quotes from participants of this study, talking about why this process, they found it to be so powerful. The first is from a local official who said that it addressed the misconception that sustainability is a choice between the environment and the economy. It really puts community and economy back into the framing of sustainability. The second comes from a developer who said, we didn't know the magnitude of what was needed in this neighborhood and how amazingly this project addresses so many of those needs. And the third comes from a community member who said, the most valuable part of this process was that we feel like our voices were heard. So my hope is that the next time you pass by a notice of construction and a public hearing, that rather than having that sense of alarm and kind of red bell going off in your head, that instead you think to yourself, what can I do to turn this development into something that my community will celebrate? Thank you.